episodes of the big interview that I like to do once in a while, that I would like to do every day if I can, put some sponsors together and make some bank. So, and we can keep our mission going, which is bringing voices to the platform that sometimes are not heard, people of color, etc. And we can always go into that at some point. But Scooch Cases, folks, I believe it is scoochcase.com. And these guys make fantabulous cases for your phone. And they have a really unique wingman feature on them. And this little wingman feature, which, it's kind of cool. You have, I think they have these little pop things or something that they put on phones. Here we go. The little wingman feature is this little hook here that you can hold on to, balance it on the table, that kind of thing. So, great case. Buy them. They're out of Carmel, Indiana. Not my, preferable state. Indiana, a little conservative, but the guys at Scooch are great. And they definitely pass my, can't be a crazy conservative test. But let's jump into it with the big interview, Afghanistan, the Taliban, and Biden, with political analyst Scott Lucas. My sister lives near Carmel. By the way, great to see you, Monique. I think we would love to have you come up here in a little bit and chat with us as well. If you would like, I can send you an invite and let me get rolling with Scott a little bit because it's his first time, but we would love to have your insight. If you want to, you don't have to. There's, I'm hopefully going to have you on the show one of these days as well. But Scott Lucas, let's go. Let's get this thing going. I just saw you the other day in my jammies, but we'll next time for sure. Awesome. That's going to be great. Hey, Pablo, great to see you, man. Very, very good to see you. I just saw you on Olga Lautman's broadcast the other day and got to jump in. I think Scott is actually a big deal. I've seen him on the Telebox. Oh no, he is the real deal. He's a political analyst and just a great guy so far. Anyway, I saw you on Olga, and Monique and Olga are all pretty big deals too, and they know their stuff. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like juicy, Russia and Afghanistan and all these things. Like, I got to jump in and hog up the comments, which I did, I think. And it was a great time. Hey, Peter, great to see you, my friend. Peter, Pablo, feel free to, jump in anytime if you want to just come up and say hi and, raise the amount of people that'll see the show. I need that feature to ping you in. Okay. So Scott, politics and all that we're going to jump into, but tell me a little bit about Scott Lucas.
Now, gosh, you're setting a low bar for the conversation if you want to know about me. But well, you can tell from my accent, I didn't actually start off on this side of the water. I actually from Alabama, from the deep South.
Whereabouts in Alabama?
I was born in Birmingham, the other Birmingham.
Oh wow, the other Birmingham.
The other Birmingham. But I grew up in Huntsville, where they make the rockets and the missiles, and so yep. Our distinguishing feature, although I didn't know it at the time, is if there was a nuclear war, we were on the top 10 target list of the Soviets. So it's like, oh, great. It never came to that, but
thankfully.
Thankfully. But it was really unusual growing up in a city which is very much in the deep South, but very much part of, that whole Cold War narrative. So our civic center was like the only civic center in the world named after a former Nazi, Werner von Braun. Of course, that's where he and the German scientists were brought to after the World War II, so we could beat the Soviets and so on. So anyway, to cut it chase, wound up over here because did a year abroad as an undergraduate student in a place called Leeds up in North England. Absolutely loved it. Forgot, as soon as I finished my first degree, I came back, was in London, loved that as well, and pitched up in Birmingham in 1989. I thought it would be like 2 years and out of here. And here we are, what, 30, more than 30 years later, and I forgot to leave. So there's that. And I worked at the University of Birmingham from 1989 till last December, teaching film, teaching music. I think you're a big buff on both, right?
I am.
Teaching politics, history, really the whole idea of trying to understand, whether it's America or the UK or the countries in the Middle East, understanding it from the ground up, from the culture, the people. And that back in, and I love academia, but around about running up before the war in 2003, the Iraq War, if you're an academic, you might write something and you don't see it published for months or even years. And I had been a journalist when I was 16 back in Alabama, and I thought, I'm going back to journalism while still being an academic. So I started off testing, like you've been testing ideas here on HAPS and elsewhere, where we were testing it in that earlier phase of the internet. And eventually that became a website, which is called EA Worldview. And I'll put the link in the box for folks.
Nice.
We started in 2008. And we initially started by, we were going to look at U.S. foreign policy, where we were going to look at U.S. politics. That was my academic background. I had written on U.S. and British foreign policy through the Cold War and beyond. But we realized with that site, because we were working with citizen journalists, we were working with other academics, we were working with, other outlets. Look, if you want to cover the world, you got to cover it not from London or Washington, but from the base up. And so we started off with this thing called Twitter, back in the early days. And we realized you could use Twitter as a portal to really link people up and get news. So our test case to get beyond the U.S. is we live covered the Israel-Gaza conflict back in 2008. And we were able to break stories before even the BBC was. And I thought, this is the way to do it here. If it's Israel and Palestine, find out what Israelis, Palestinians think. So we've been covering Iran every day since 2009, since the mass protests there over the disputed election. When the uprisings across the Middle East and North Africa occurred, we started covering that. We still cover Syria on a daily basis and other parts of the Middle East. And we cover the UK and this absolute disaster called Brexit. And with Monique and with Olga, who you mentioned, Olga Lautman and Monique Cameron, we're paired up with Kremlin File to cover Russia. So it's very much the idea that in this world that we're in, we all need each other. It's not like you can rely on the presidents and the prime ministers and the generals. A case like Afghanistan, which we're going to talk about, proves you got to be able to get dialogue with each other to find out what's happening. Plus, the fact is, you got to know where the good guys and gals are versus the bad guys and gals, because there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation out there.
Sorry, just makes me think of the tens of thousands of Afghans. Are they Afghanis? Is that what do we call them? Afghans
is what we go with. Yeah.
Afghans. So the tens of thousands that want to get out because they helped or aided us. And this idea of, the U.S., it's very difficult to go in and, though I guess we didn't want to conquer Afghanistan when we invaded, when you don't speak the language and you don't know the culture. And I think what you're speaking to is getting that culture out there, and the messages out there. I mean, I am freaked out. I don't, have a huge vested interest in Afghanistan per se. I have a good friend that lives in Tehran, and that bothers me because it heats things up there, and so I'm worried about her. But the thing is that the women and the girls, I mean, again, cutting somebody's hand off because they steal, that just doesn't work for me. And this is a disaster, and it's Biden's fault. And sorry for stopping your train of thought there, but I'm really mad right now.
Yeah, and as am I. I mean, we'll get into the meat of the subject really quickly, but I'll just tell you, look, the thing is, and I've always been, whenever I've worked with students, and I've been so fortunate to work with great students, some of whom are doing wonderful things, or whenever I'm talking, with you or, other folks, it's like you start off with the fact that none of us is objective. none of us is completely detached from what is happening. And I found this past week, generally, I've been very supportive of the Biden administration in terms of what it's trying to do domestically, with the exception of immigration.
Yeah.
Where, but generally, I think they've supported. I wasn't, and it's like, okay, supporting the domestic program. Generally, I think I've been supportive of them on a lot of foreign policy issues, certainly on rebuilding alliances, rebuilding partnerships. But this past couple of weeks over Afghanistan, and finally, it came. I'll tell you when it came out. I'll tell folks a story if you don't mind.
No, please. That's why you're here, my friend.
So when Biden gave the speech, must have been on it was on Monday, I think, right? And so Kabul had fallen to the Taliban the day before, like that big sweep, and people remember it. We saw those scenes out at Kabul airport. Now, there's no way as an analyst that I can be dispassionate when I'm sitting there looking at Afghans who are desperately trying to get out of the country and hanging on the wheels of aircraft to get out.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd been invited onto a very good outlet, BBC 5 Live, but a very good guy named Colin Murray, really impressive interview. And he said, look, come on, and we'll talk before Biden speaks, and we'll talk afterwards. And so I was doing all the analyst stuff beforehand, setting up context, where we are, what Biden might say, why the withdrawal was so quick. And Biden comes out and says, like second or third line in the speech, I'm here to talk to you about American interest in Afghanistan. And that was, I was already like, red flag. Wait a minute. I want to know about Afghans. I want to know what the situation is for those folks under the Taliban. And you're coming at me and you're going to tell me about American interest, right? That speech was a pretty long speech. That was about a 15, 60-minute speech, right? Not once did he mention the Afghan people. Not once. He talked about human rights and democracy generally at one point, but he never mentioned the situation that they face. He never said, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. Even if he didn't support the Obama policy, I'm sorry for the fact that we tried to build up the nation and it didn't work. Never said it. And I've got to go back and talk to Colin Murray and give an immediate analyst reaction. And Colin came to me and I just simply said, look, as an analyst, I can tell you, I can understand the reasoning that Biden has put out there. But as a person, I'm almost furious. And it's just laying it out there for Colin, which is, I'm not going to sit here and be completely cold and neutral on this. I didn't quite say I'm pissed off, but I was just really, really pissed off. And then by chance, that interview went so well that Colin Murray does a weekly program. I come back on last night to join him to do his show on U.S. politics. And they've got a Democratic political analyst out there, guy out of L.A. Nice guy, Drexel Hurd. But Drexel's given it the same line about, from an American point of view, we got to get the Americans out. We'll get the Americans back home. And if Biden does that, it'll be successful. And I'm like, Drexel, what about the Afghans? Where the hell, come on. Stop doing this America First crap. Mm-hmm. Sorry, folks, if that's not academic for you. Stop doing this America First line that Trump was running, that we all hated, that the only interest are American interest. But Biden's doing exactly that, at least over Afghanistan. So, yeah, I mean, I can play analyst with you now and take it from the ground up and go through the politics and military stuff, but that's just to put cards on the table. This has just been a disaster.
I would say that pretty much I agree with you on most of Biden's domestic policy. Let's just, call it what it is on his immigration policy, which is just disastrous. And I think he's detaining more people than Trump did. And that's just a lovely thing about American presidents. They just never notch it fucking back down. Excuse my French. And, we'll get back to Afghanistan, but even the economists, oh no, these prices will go down. No, they won't. I don't care if inflation stops. Prices never go down. And I mean, they do, but we're not going to see it, the middle class. Anyway, so Afghanistan and Biden, that is obviously kind of the focus. We put it out there today. And I do want to say that I'm deeply disappointed with Joe Biden. I'm not, if anybody that knows me, I'm not pro-war. I like to say I'm a pacifist until you punch me in the face. I mean, I'm not going to just sit there and let you punch me, but I'm not very pro-violence at all. And I don't know how many trillion they spent in Afghanistan, Scott, but I could have done better with the money. I got to be honest. I could have done better, and I don't know anything about geopolitics or Afghanistan or speak the language or anything, and I could have done better. That they did not, for a couple of $1 trillion, build a better society speaks to the fact that we should have asked the Afghanis what they wanted, and what a better society might look to them. But anyway, I'll shush and I'll let you react a bit.
Well, I mean, if you go back with context, and folks, we could take this all the way back to when, Afghanistan in the 70s, there's a space in the 20th century. So for those of you that hear the line that, the Afghans always been conflict, always been, battles of outside powers. There's a period in the 20th century where they're building up their system. They're building a political system. It's, an elected system. Then you get effectively a group of what you might call basically extremist radicals in the 70s that have a coup throughout the government. The Soviets then intervene. Off we go. And the country effectively since the 70s has been a fragmented country. It's not just one Afghanistan. We can go in deep and say there's many different areas that are there. But if you're going to talk about American involvement, of course, we're talking 2001. And I can remember in 2001, I didn't support the American intervention in Afghanistan. I thought, look, 9/11 has happened. And I thought, if you want to get Osama bin Laden, you talk to the Taliban to get Osama bin Laden. You don't go on and bomb the hell out of the country. But the Bush folks were committed to regime change in the sense that the Taliban were provided the safe haven. So they're going to do regime change. Before they do regime change in Iraq, they do regime change in Afghanistan, to cut it short. So I don't support it. But you know what Colin Powell said, and of course Powell, Secretary of State of the Bush administration, in the 80s when he was with Reagan, he said, you break it, you buy it. Well, folks, you intervene, you support the Northern Alliance to overthrow it, you've broken it, you bought it, you're in there.
Mm-hmm.
So when Biden comes up 20 years later, and I fully agree with you, and forgive me, do I call you Rev Mac or do I call you?
Oh, Rev. Revolution? My name's Revolution, so just Rev is fine.
We go with Rev, which I like that because my father's a preacher and I call him Rev as well. So all right,
there you go.
So Rev, so it's like 20 years later, we got a corrupt Afghan government. It is not legitimate for many people across the country, which is this very fragmented place. Has a lot of different local leaders, including the Taliban. It has an elite which does not match the grassroots. For all that advance we got of women, of healthcare, education, the guys at the top are pretty much in it for themselves. And so at the end of the day, they're inept, they're dysfunctional, they're derelict in their duties. And that's what Biden's seeing as well. Fair enough. So if you're saying, look, we've got to withdraw, because it's an unending thing. They're never going to be able to stand up on their own. Fine, you withdraw, but you do it in a way that I think would be sensible and pays attention at least to the Afghans. And we can go into the context of this a bit, but this started with the Trump folks, not with Trump. Trump had no damn clue what was happening in Afghanistan, and he kept fouling stuff up. But the Trump folks were trying to disengage, and they were having talks with the Taliban, trying to get the Afghan government into it, from about the end of 2019 in Qatar, in the Gulf. And those talks are ongoing. Those talks are still going in April of this year in 2021, which is probably talking about like a power sharing agreement, right? That's probably what you're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
And then Biden pops up in April and says, we're out of here. We're withdrawing. Now, I don't know if people remember this, but there's something to me that was really important in that announcement. Do you remember the date, Rev, that he gave on when everybody would be out by?
I don't. I mean, because I know it's now the end of the month, right?
Yeah. September 11th. He said September. Yeah, and you know exactly where I'm going. Oh, okay, fine. 9/11 20th anniversary, and all the boys are going to be coming home by then. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, okay, you're playing to domestic audience right there. And it's like, but what you've done is you've just telegraphed to the Taliban, not only are we withdrawing, here's your timetable. And from that point on, and I said it at the time, I said, look, Taliban are not going to negotiate. They're not going to go in with any type of political deal to join the government. They don't have to. They're going to turn to force of arms now because the Americans are cutting out. And that's exactly what they did. They started going far away from Kabul. Afghan's a very big country, lots of different scattered areas, rural cities in the north, south, and west. And they started cutting deals both with Afghan soldiers and say, look, the Americans are out of here. You better choose your side. And with all like these local commanders, a guy named General Dashtum up in the north, Ismail Khan in the west. And they started cutting deals, which is, look, you can either fight us or you can stand aside and you don't have the Americans with you. And you can guess what happened. And this process of melting away was taking place long before the past 2 weeks, if you were really watching. But of course, what happened is about the start of April, they started moving into the provincial capitals. And you could just see them go through the capitals, right? And here's where I've got another beef with Biden, which is in the middle of this. If Biden had come out and been honest and said, look, guys, the Taliban are going to take over. Because U.S. intelligence were telling, and said in July, it's 6 months. It's a 6-month window before the Taliban are going to take over. Yet Biden at a press conference in July says, oh, no. This isn't inevitable. Taliban takeover. Afghan government can stand up. Afghan forces can stand up. All of this, yada, 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 right? And then at the start of this month, then U.S. intelligence services, who are pissed off, by the way, they leak it, which is our window is 3 months now. And then it came down to weeks. And then it's like, oh, hell, they're in Kabul. And it's like, and so this entire idea of that when the American public started not noticing what was going on in Afghanistan, and I can understand why they don't notice before August. The place is far away. You don't have time to notice it. But when they start noticing, everything's already been locked in to the extent, and I can understand why they did it, but let's be honest here, that the U.S. in the past week before Kabul fell was talking as much at least to the Taliban as it was to the Afghan government, because they were telling the Taliban, guys, if you come into Kabul, don't touch our embassy. Don't touch our embassy.
Yeah, well, that would be vital news to the president of Afghanistan if he knew that they just told the Taliban, look, I know you're coming, we know it, but just leave our people alone, and we'll play nice and let you take over the country and destroy people's lives. Because we're America, we just like to do that. Before we keep going, we'll get back onto this track here. Let's jump into the comments a bit, because I know we've had a lot of them, and let's go all the way back here. Whenever I talk with Scott, he always brings in tasty tidbits of info. Bravo, and well done so far. And I did want to talk about this one. Have you ever advised government on foreign policy at all in any official capacity or unofficial?
Yes, but only, and I think I put it in the comments, but only when I thought the cause was good and I thought the officials were reliable. So
or well-intended.
So I'm not a person who will be completely, all governments, governments have their interests. We know that. But where I think their interests are actually a positive interest in it. So I've talked with folks about Iran, in which something I'm deeply invested in. It's interesting to hear you have a friend in Tehran. I've actually taught there, and not since 2009 for reasons we can go into. But I've talked to folks about Syria. We're deeply invested. I've talked to them about U.S.-UK relations quite often. And I've talked to governments quite often, which is how can you build up in a positive way, as it were, in activism, which is, all right, we as activists quite often don't trust governments quite rightly. What do governments need to do when they come to us on certain issues to get us to buy in? Where does that interaction have to take place? In other words, the idea of a civil society in which society is the emphasis here, not the emphasis pursuing whatever the government's, goal of the day is.
Yeah, the civil society. I mean, it's so easy to get sidetracked in this, like, the aliens invaded and the world didn't band together to defeat them. Oh no, we just did nothing or went our own separate ways, or in America just gave up on COVID and let 600,000 people die. Whatever, so much for civil society. But
Rob, let me jump in there. And I know we're talking Afghanistan. I'm going to tell you one of the most important films for me in terms of understanding America with respect to our American friends, and why, in a way, America walks away from a place like Afghanistan when it gets really tough. And that is the 1950s, 51 or 53 version of War of the Worlds, right? Now, you folks out there who are the young folks, it was a radio program a long time ago, part of the World War II. That film's an interesting Cold War film for me, because it's not that the Americans win. because the aliens come marching in, right? And like America's like running around in panic. They don't trust the scientists anymore, foreshadowing where we are over the pandemic. They don't trust intellectuals, certainly. They don't trust their leaders, which is fair enough. And at the end of the day, the only reason why America survives is because like there's this intervention by God somehow that knocks all the aliens out, and they're on the mountainside singing like some religious hymn, and it's like, okay, guys, you just got lucky that the aliens dropped at this point. In other
Right.
words, when the going gets really tough in a conflict, War of the Worlds is about the fact that people just simply bail out, right? And here I am 70 years later going, guess what we did in Afghanistan? But this time, I don't think God's going to jump in and knock the Taliban out with some strange bioweapon.
No, but the Chinese won't either, because they're going to be big in Afghanistan. I think we could talk about that too.
Sure.
Scott and Rev, do you think they will change? I think that Monique's point, to pull my head back there far enough, I'm not exactly sure what we were talking about.
Would they change? I think we're talking about the Taliban. Probably Taliban. I think it's. I'm going to pretend that's what my good friend Monique is asking for, right? I think that's an open question, and I've done a lot of work in the past 72 hours, and interestingly enough, a lot of work with Indian outlets, and India's scared to death of this for reasons we can go into. They think the Taliban and Pakistan are going to hook up. They think that means that's an attack on India. I do think one thing to watch out for is an escalation in Pakistan, tension between India and Pakistan. But to get to the nub of it, look, we don't know about the Taliban. We don't know in an overall sense. They have only been in Kabul for about 4 days. They got in there so quickly, they weren't organized. That's how quick the advance was. So now they've got to form, not just, they've held parts of Afghanistan for years, but now they've got to have a national administration. They got to have security forces. They've got to have someone to distribute money. They've got the housing. They got it. Everything is on their watch now. And so what you get is this almighty scramble occurring inside the country as they try to decide what they're going to do and how they rule. And then they're going to put out to the international community.
Now, well, are look, yeah. I don't want to give them any, I don't want to give the Taliban, I don't know what the right word is. Look, they're thugs, they're criminals, they're, I'm a determinist, so, evil is not a thing to me, but they're, they're bad actors, and we shouldn't be giving them any benefit of the doubt ever, because they have not proven over 20 years to have changed their ways, other than they know how to write a press release or two now or give a speech. But I do wonder what you think about being 20 years later, if the Taliban, quote unquote, has matured. You've got 20 years older, the older leaders of the Taliban or whatever, then will they kind of maybe try to create a society like Iran that's pretty, maybe more locked down, but maybe we won't see genocide of hundreds of thousands of Afghans,
I mean, let's unpack this, right? In some ways. First of all, let me unpack to you where the Taliban, I think, are different from 20 years ago that I think you can clearly see, and that is the way they project outward. Because remember, the Taliban were only recognized by 3 governments before 2001. They were only recognized by the Saudis, by UAE, and by Pakistan.
Not even North Korea. Wow.
Not even North Korea. The Iranians were quite hostile to them, especially because they killed Iranian diplomats and Iranian journalists. China didn't recognize them. And the Taliban, look, it wasn't just the Americans backing other factions that knocked the Taliban out so quickly in 2001 in Kabul. It's the fact that they had isolated themselves. And they pissed off a lot of Afghan people. This time, it's like, all right, we're going to establish the international links. They need that economically. I mean, Afghanistan's got like 14 million people who are in extreme poverty, 2 million of children in extreme poverty. They're have been dependent on development funding, of course, a lot of which has been wasted, but they're still dependent on it.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I try not to curse during these like political shows, but I'm just like, development money. How many trillions did we put in that damn country? You know what I mean? Like, no. Oh my God. Look, they should be all driving Benzes and living in mansions for all the money that we put there for those 14 million folks. Sorry to break your train of thought.
And the folks in the Afghan government were living in mansions and driving Benzes.
Yes.
That's the whole point.
Taking all the money.
But anyway, the Taliban, like economically, they got an economy they got to keep going somehow. You can't just simply sell poppy and make that your entire basis.
Right.
So how are they going to do it? So they're going to reach out and they're going to tell the international community first, oh, no, we're not going to harbor terrorists. We're not going to harbor terrorist attacks, right? Yeah. We'll let women have higher education. But get specific on where they're aiming their message really quickly. I mean, first of all, Pakistan is brokering this. Pakistan is basically mediating talks between the Taliban and former leaders like former President Karzai. Pakistan's back in a power position, right? But beyond that, it's China. China, in contrast to 20 years ago, we didn't have a Belt and Road Initiative 20 years ago. China wasn't pursuing an alternative economic system 20 years ago. They are now. And Afghanistan could have a place in it if it is stable. If the country can function, then it's like, okay, China's already got close links with Pakistan, huge links that have developed. They're developing massive, not only facilities inside Pakistan, but the big port at Gwadar. Afghanistan's got mineral resources. It's got the potential for pipelines. So the Taliban know that. The Taliban are going to calculate that. But China also worries about the Taliban because they worry about, China's issue with Xinjiang province and those damn Uyghur Muslims. Damn is being said sarcastically.
Right.
And the Uyghur Muslims. And it's like, so they're saying to don't be supporting the separatists. Don't be supporting anybody over the Uyghur cause on this, right? What happens in Afghanistan stays in Afghanistan. What happens in China stays in China. Russia's got a similar line.
Wait. Would there be sympathy with the Uyghurs? Is that what you're saying?
Where China's worried it could be. China's worried.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Right. And Russia's worried about the same thing. I mean, Russia's got various Islamist groups.
Right.
Right. And Russia's clamped down hard on them. Putin's made his name by clamping down hard on them. They don't want the Taliban
and looks like we are back.
Correct.
And you're not frozen? Correct. Fantastic. Let me just say real quick, folks, we are talking with Professor Emeritus at the University of Birmingham. That's the good one, according to Perry Pilot in England. And Scott Lucas is really knowledgeable on Afghanistan. I would say he's an expert, and he is deep into politics in that part of the world and journalism, and we are having a discussion about the state of Afghanistan. So I'll let you pick it up where we left off, Scott.
Yeah. So welcome back, folks, and thank you, Haps, for getting us back on. So in terms of, we're talking about the Taliban, will they change? And I think the change is how they maneuver in this kaleidoscope that's in Asia, especially because the Americans have left the building. That's a key thing.
Boy, in more ways than one, because you were just talking about China and investments in Pakistan, Africa, the Middle East. Like, America, folks, I hate to break the news to you. Yeah, we're not a thing anymore. We're dying. Anyway, keep going.
So the other group, because we talked about China's interest, the other group that I would watch, Rob, is the Gulf states. Remember that Saudi Arabia,
specifically any states, Saudi and
UAE to start off with. Remember, they recognize the Taliban 1.0, and so
gotcha.
again, in terms of Saudi Arabia and UAE also look east. They don't just simply look back now to Washington in terms of that strategic alliance you're talking about. They've been very quiet and they've kept their heads down. But they are. I think you're going to have a whole series of groups that are going to be maneuvering with the Taliban and judging whether or not we engage with them, where we engage with them. They will not making that engagement conditional, however, on the Taliban reforming, which brings us to will the Taliban change inside Afghanistan? I think here's what I've got in terms of what we're seeing so far. And the reason why I was cautious, and my wife, bless her, held me up on this quite right. And she said, don't be fence sitting. I was cautious in saying, well, look, until we see the Taliban establishing their authority, until we see whether or not they get control over their fighters in individual places. I can't tell you 100% where it might be going. I think what we are seeing so far, however, is that you're seeing the incidents where Taliban units, if you want to call them that, or just Taliban fighters, they are firing on demonstrators. They are beating demonstrators in certain places in Afghanistan. They are knocking on doors.
Yeah, that's what we've heard, right?
Warning people. Exactly. And in many respects, it's not as bad as you might think in those areas on the evidence we've got so far, because Afghans are policing themselves. Women are going inside and they're not going on in public. I'm sure your folks will have seen all the posters of women that people immediately tore down or defaced before the Taliban could get to them. But one thing to keep in mind, beyond right now, we just have like individual pockets of news. We really only get this news so far really from 3 cities, from Kabul, obviously, a city called Jalalabad, and Abbottabad, Asadabad, where we had firing on protesters and several deaths. That's just in the east of the country. So we're not seeing what's happening up in the north, say Mazar Sharif, or in the south, in Kandahar. We're not seeing what's happening in Herat in the west. So we don't know how extensive the control is. Right?
They have some independent media, right, and state media, but I'm assuming then what you're saying is all of those cities, we're not getting any media out of them.
It's hard. I mean, Tolo News. If you folks watch Tolo News, TOLO News is probably the number one independent that comes out of Afghanistan, right? And they do have an English language site, and so it was interesting in that one thing the Taliban did in terms of their internal PR is they immediately put on a Taliban spokesman with one of Tolo's interviewers.
I heard that, yeah.
Which was a woman, right? Now that's the first part of the story. It's like, oh yeah. Well, the second part of the story is she's now blocked from broadcasting, right?
Wow.
I think my general starting point is I think that the general political, economic, and religious approach of the Taliban is the same as it is in the 90s. There has not been a shift in what someone and I think this is a quite useful correction. I used to call it a strict version of Sharia. And then they said, no, don't call it a strict version of Sharia law. Call it a radical version of Sharia law. That it's radical, that the Taliban are even beyond other groups and arguably even beyond the Wahhabis, right, in the way that they implement this that comes in. And I think I would be very surprised if the Taliban make significant social changes from where they were in the 90s. I think they will say that women might be able to go into certain educational spaces if they're segregated. So there may be secondary education if it's segregated. I think you may see that women can go into certain public spaces if they are segregated. But I think in the idea of women in leadership positions or women having a significant role in political space, that's just not going to happen. And
well, then what? Well, hold on one sec. Thanks for stopping by, Deanna. Great to see you. And Monique had a question back there too, and Joy's been contributing nicely. But I heard that they said that the women. I don't know the nomenclature of the burqa and all the various assemblages of all of that, but I think I heard even down to covering their hands. So like total 100% coverage, some little slot to see out or whatever. And there are millions of Afghan women that didn't dress like this, for a long time. I mean, there's a difference between 20 years ago, and even though we didn't accomplish things in Afghanistan that would have been nice to accomplish, it's a different society and a different culture, though, isn't it, than the one that was taken over 20 years ago? And if so, how's that going to make this transition harder or easier, maybe, for the Taliban?
That's an extremely important point, Rob, in that, cultures don't remain static. Young folks come up. I've got 2 kids in their 20s now, and trust me, I don't understand some of their culture, and I'm sure they don't understand some of mine. And you have a generation which, however imperfect the government was, and it was way imperfect, there was more space, political and cultural space for many people in Afghanistan. And can you shut that space down and expect people to really follow the rules? I think and I'm going to be very cautious here because the two countries are not the same. There's significant differences. But next door to Afghanistan is Iran. And Iran, of course, has had, before the Taliban, I think arguably Iran had the only religious revolution of the 20th century. There were various revolutions and so on, but Iran's was always based on, a particular view of Islam, especially when they cracked down on other left-wing groups, other people who were against the Shah, and they, consolidated their authority. What the Iranians did, the Iranian theocracy, if you will, has been to maintain certain ideological lines that they hold out with the supreme leader, while having to contend with the fact that you have Iranian generations who have had different cultural point of views. They have changed. And quite often, if you go to Iran, you hear about first generation, second generation, third generation. Iran still has a theocracy. It's a theocracy in a very, very heavily managed system, however, a heavily securitized system, and a system that almost broke in 2009. But there's a big difference between Iran and Afghanistan, Rev, in this sense. And that is that Iran already had a generation. There was much more interchange with the West under Iran than there was under the Taliban.
Hang on.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. My headphones just indicated that they were going to die on me. Hang on.
Okay.
I got to get the sound volume down. All right, go ahead, Scott.
I'll just talk to everybody else, Ref. The Iranians had much more links with the West, because the Iranians, they pride themselves on technology, science, et cetera, and you don't get that if you cut yourself off entirely from the West. So a lot of Iranians still move. Some Iranians moved, studied in the West, including some people in the current Iranian leadership. With the Taliban, of course, you didn't have that movement between young folks in the outside and so on. So they've had it now for this space of 20 years. What does that mean now? What does that mean that they actually come up and challenge the Taliban? Too early to tell. Absolutely too early to tell what's going down. Rev, while you're setting out the headphones, I'm going to scroll back through the comments, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
There has just been some absolutely fantastic comments going through. Joy's made a comment, which I think is important in setting up the immediate context here, which is the fact that many Afghan soldiers, she says unpaid. I think they were paid something, but they were relatively low paid. And the conditions under which they served quite often were atrocious in terms of food and basics. And the Taliban exploited that. And those soldiers would have known how much money was pouring into the country. So that actually just, accentuated the difficulties where the Taliban could come in. There's an extremely interesting argument here from Brett, which is, was the U.S. exporting their own shortcomings? I just think the idea here is that there is a difference that we can talk about, Rev, that I think is important, which is that the notion of intervening in a country, some people call it humanitarian intervention and liberal intervention. I actually think it's important that when you intervene in a country, you do so not to remake that country. We're not there to remake or impose democracy. We're there to support people who are already there. There were some very good folks on the ground who did that. They happen to be Americans, happen to be Europeans, happen to be from other parts of the world. Some worked for the UN. There were good efforts there to actually empower Afghans who could empower themselves and give them the space to do it. And I don't want to forget those folks for all the failings of the U.S. government that take place that have gone in. So just wanted to pick up on a couple of those points that come in. I don't know where I'll tell you what, if you don't mind, Rev, I'll pick up on another one that goes here. I think the point that is made, Perry Piatt's made the point, which is that girls can get educated, but the Taliban will dictate the curriculum. That's an incredibly good point, because it's one thing, and you'll know it in societies over here, we can have space in education, healthcare, whatever, but if the governing authorities define what that space is, we're still limited. So if the Taliban say you can study this, but not this, or you can go up to a certain level, but you can't, for example, be a doctor or be a lawyer or be an accountant, then we're going to still have the same problem. But Monique had raised a similar point there, which is about, will they be allowed to study everything? Let me tell you a story here, and I can tell it now because I'm no longer at the University of Birmingham, which is a story that tells you it's not just an Afghanistan issue, but we'll just use it when we think about Afghanistan. When Birmingham set up a university in Dubai, UAE, and you all will know that a lot of American and British and even European universities wanted to get into the Gulf states. Went up there. We got the message back from the UAE. We could not teach my area. We could not teach politics. We could not teach history at university level. We could not teach film. We couldn't teach cultural studies. What we could teach out in the UAE was engineering and business, right? The practical things. And if you take that, and that's in the UAE, and that's in the UAE, which has some space, but different kind of space. So if the Taliban come in and say, look, women can study certain subjects, but not these subjects, you're still going to have the same issues. If the Taliban come in and say, well, women can get this type of healthcare, but let's say, for example, not other parts of healthcare. And again, let's be honest with ourselves. The United States regulates healthcare in terms of, you want to talk about abortions, you want to talk about family planning, right? Well, the Taliban could do the same thing in Afghanistan under their version of Sharia that takes place. And of course, they can say everybody has a right to justice. And there is an argument out there that one reason where the Taliban has been effective in villages is they have had a system of justice that was better than the Afghan government had, because at least they had a system of justice where rights could be wrong. But in other words, the Taliban will define the laws, the application of the laws. The judges will be Taliban judges. And
Right.
so even if everyone has access to the legal system, the parameters are set.
Hey, let me switch it up just a little in the sense that I want to make sure we ask this question.
Okay.
And we can keep going for a little while. I do have a 7-year-old returning from the park, so you might get to take over for a minute while I let him in. I should have given him the keys. I mean, don't worry, folks. He's with friends. They took him to a park. Who in Afghanistan? So we've got 14 million people. Does anybody in Afghanistan want the Taliban to be there? Like, who supports the Taliban? Like 2 million, 6 million, 12 people? Like,
Yeah. It's even bigger. It's 35 million people, Rev. So it's
for the whole country?
For the whole country. 14 million in poverty, but 35 million.
Gotcha.
Again, Rev, when you do it, you kind of have to break it down with the fact that Afghanistan is not just one country, that it's like different pockets, right? And in the West, quite often when we hear about Afghanistan, we were hearing about Kabul,
right?
For obvious reasons, primarily the east of the country, sometimes the south. Sorry, I got myself wonky on my shot. Let me get back centered. So what I would say is this, that the Taliban were never completely taken out of power after 2001. Something I don't know if people know. What happened is they got knocked out of Kabul. They got knocked out of the major cities, but they still were present in rural areas. And even before this year, they had control, some analysts estimate, of about half the country, right?
Oh, wow.
But it wasn't just that the Taliban were there in the rural areas. The Afghan government wasn't really the authority in other parts. If you go up to Mazar-e-Sharif, the guy up there is a military guy named.
Is that closer to Pakistan?
It's up closer to Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, right?
Gotcha.
So up in the north, right? And again, by the way, folks, if we go deep later on, because we're coming up to an hour here, but one thing about Afghanistan is that you've got Tajiks, you've got Uzbeks, you've got Pashto, you've got Dari, you've got Hazara, you've got various groups that are there. Anyway, in the north, it was a guy named General Dostum who had worked with the Soviets, then he was against the Soviets, then he had worked with the Americans, etc. In the west, it was an Iranian-supported local leader named Ismail Khan. So you had all these various factions that were through there. Where the Taliban were effective is they would go to people and say, look, you're not secure here, are you? There's still all this violence. You need someone to protect you. We're the people to protect you, right? And so they would go in and set up their own system of justice and so on. And people might buy it, because before that, the rich guys would get away with everything, right? Farmers couldn't get compensated if they felt they'd lost crops and so on, and the Taliban at least could do that. So that system of local justice they put in was important. Second story is that they were big in certain areas, of course, where there was poppy grown, where there was opium, which was coming out of it, because they would control it, and then they would distribute the funds from opium on what they would say is a fairer basis across these villages, whereas in other parts of Afghanistan, it was like the really, really rich guys that were benefiting off the opium production, and it wasn't trickling down in terms of the funds that went through there. So the Taliban actually had this footing in rural areas. And if where the Brits were involved, because the Brits and the Americans were in different parts of the country, international coalition was different parts of the country, but Helmand province in the center. And Afghanistan was never removed from Helmand province because they had a lot of local support there. And the other thing is, remember what the Taliban could play on is they could play on the ideas which they were the group that stood against the foreigners. And you can't underestimate that. They played to a sense of Afghan nationalism, which is not the same Afghan nationalism that we saw yesterday on Independence Day, but it was an Afghan nationalism, or at least a local idea of these foreigners have been coming into our country for centuries.
Right.
The Taliban stay against them. Now, does that mean I think the Taliban have a majority support across the country? I can't tell you. There's no way of testing that in terms of numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happens here is that until you get the Taliban putting in their own system, then the test only begins then, when they put their system in, right? Just as over the past 20 years, what I think I can tell you is there were never a majority of Afghans that bought into the system that was set up because the institutions weren't strong enough. Right?
Yeah, well, my gosh, I think we probably should definitely do, and we could maybe bring in some more folks too, but do an episode about a bit of the history of the last 20 years and what we did and didn't do, because it just makes me, think about just a country that is so fragmented, and when the majority of the people don't agree with the government that you've more or less installed, which I think would have been apparent a while ago, one would think you might be trying to show the Afghan people, not the leaders, okay, look, you stole all your money, you got all your money, stop, and let's build a government a little better. Or we're kind of thinking you might need to retire from politics, and move them on. But I mean, we did have a military, we were a force. I'm not endorsing this, but this is just a colossal American F up. We're really good at this as Americans in doing military things and screwing them up.
But Rev, let me just tell you, yeah, let's harsh on American. Almost every foreign power screws it up that way.
Well, that's true. I shouldn't just pick on Americans. War's probably not the best solution, first of all.
Yeah. In other words, the Soviets screwed it up in their own way back in the 80s with local leaders. The British have screwed it up
Thank you,
around
JB.
the world in terms of local leaders. Just take this as a specific case, and that is, for example, who were those local leaders that the Americans backed? It took several. In effect, after 2001, it was Harmon Karzai. Now, who's Harmon Karzai? Right.
And I was going to say, who is Harmon Karzai, right?
Yeah. Harmon Karzai.
Wait, hold on. Let me see if I can, because I'm literally remembering back to the first times I've ever heard his name. And no, I just think he wasn't in Afghanistan when all that was going down. But otherwise, keep going.
I think his brother actually was based in Chicago in 2001, if I remember correctly. I think his brother has a business in Chicago. And Karzai, was really well known to the Americans. And Karzai was not actually a member of the Northern Alliance. That was the main group that the Americans supported that came in and knocked him off. But he was like the guy that the Americans thought, okay, this guy can reach out and keep acceptable to a whole number of Americans and so on. So we'll be with Harmon. And Karzai talks a good game. Talks a really good game. But Karzai had his group of people around him who are from a particular community in Afghanistan that, right? Largely the support that was coming in was from the Pashtun community. And Karzai was there from 2001 to 2014, right? And finally, things got so brutal because remember that Obama escalated the military in 2009. He built up the military and said, all right, this is when the real nation building push came in, right? So, okay, we're going to escalate the military. And then in 2014, we technically ended our combat role in Afghanistan. Now we were just going to have the military there to help them with logistics, to help them with their projects, right? Counterterrorism, of course, yada yada yada.
Mm-hmm.
And then they bring in President Ghani. And President Ghani comes in as a technocrat, right? I think an anthropologist by training, if I remember right. He had written this whole thing about how to fix failed states. And so everybody comes in and says, well, look, Ghani's going to fix the corruption. He's going to fix that. But Ghani then got his own group of people around him, and off we go again. And what you never had is, and if you want to get really mythical about it, look, when South Africa came out of apartheid, it had a Mandela, right?
Mm-hmm.
It had a figure that could channel something in all that was good, the values. Now, South Africa, since Mandela, if you look at it, has got a series of problems, including corruption.
Hey, just to because that is a very interesting subject, and I want to say that, and I'm no expert. Lord knows, I dropped out of film school to start working in film, but South Africa, I'm not going to say it was a mistake, because there's no mistakes in getting your freedom. But what I would have done differently is, in my mind, the white people just gave up the political power because they kept all the money. And that has been a big problem in South Africa since, the transition to Mandela and everything. Again, I'm not saying how you could do that, or that they dropped the ball, but try to run a country with no resources, no wealthy class to get educated, to trickle down things, whatever system that it is. The whites still control the money in South Africa. And sorry, we got diverted, and that's a problem. But I can see that same kind of thing, in any country, even Afghanistan.
Yeah, you think you had a Mandela who was at least a unifying figure in terms of the idea that came up there, and we could talk about other countries that have had unifying figures that come out. There's or have had unifying systems that people buy into. And again, I don't want to walk people all the way back, but if you want to take a story about Germany and Japan, how Germany and Japan take their course after World War II, you've got to go not just that the Americans were there. You've got to talk about what came up from the ground. Look, Afghanistan has not had that unifying figure. They haven't even had a unifying group. They've got a lot of good people there. They've got some good politicians there. They've got some good women politicians there, but they never had the space or the ability to get up into the top ranks. And so what you were left with was really the husk of a government by the time this all came out, to the extent that our viewers will know the story, that when the crunch came down, President Ghani took off, and someone put out the rumor he was in Tajikistan. He never was in Tajikistan. He took off to UAE, which for its own reason.
I would go, UAE's, actually pretty nice, what I hear. So
yeah, it's like, enjoy yourself.
Other than,
Yeah, and another member of the government said that he took, Taliban, Afghan ambassador said he took off with $170 million, and Ghani says, no, I didn't take off with anything except the clothes on my back. Here you go, yeah. But here's one thing I think.
When he put it in his suitcase, I mean, if he did a wire transfer, golden parachute.
There you go, golden parachute. There's
go for it, buddy. We wasted $2 trillion. I authorize you as an American citizen that you can take that $170 million and, go for it.
Yeah, but here is something to watch out for, because we're coming up, I think, on the hour mark, Rev. So here's one thing to watch out for, folks, in terms of the week ahead, to pick it up on, in terms of one thing is, by the way, before I say this, and my wife, I've said it to my wife's close friend. I've talked to Monique Kamara about this and so on, about stay mentally sane, right? This is really affecting a lot of people. Even if we're thousands of miles away, it's affecting us. But if you can, find out what local initiatives are there. For example, local initiatives which are trying to get Afghans out of the country, or that are trying to support the NGOs who are still in the country. The Taliban are still allowing NGOs there. So do that. But anyway, the week ahead, the Taliban are going to have to try to establish their authority. Now, you're going to hear a lot about this will be focused on the airport and whether the Americans can get their folks out. They probably will. They probably will be able to get the Americans out, but not the Afghans out. But here, beyond this, is that the Taliban face an immediate issue, which is the number of protests that are coming up. And Monique has asked whether the protests will grow in Kabul. I don't know yet. because I think people will want to protest, but there will also be the idea of repressing it. But there is another story which is running, and that is there is one province. Did you know, Rev, there's one province the Taliban haven't taken over yet?
I did not know that.
It's called the Panjshir Valley, and it's in northeast Afghanistan, and it is famous in lore because it's never given way to foreigners or other bad guys. So, for example, the Soviets can never pacify it, the Brits can never pacify it, and the Panjshir Valley is where there was a movement, an anti-Taliban movement, led by a man named Masood. He was assassinated 2 days before 9/11 by the Taliban, which sort of spurred the Northern Alliance, right, to make their move with the Americans to get the Taliban out of there.
Hey, let me just jump in, Scott, because I don't want people to think I'm being rude. I'm looking for some of those resources for helping women and stuff in there. That's when my head is turned away. I'm still hearing you, my friend, but keep talking.
Right. So in the Panjshir Valley, the former vice president, or at least he still calls himself the president, a man named Mr. Saleh, S-A-L-E-H. Saleh, who has declared himself the acting president because Ghani's out of the country, he's in the Panjshir Valley now, and he is allied with the son of the famous leader Masood, who was killed in 2001. They will try to build up the idea of a resistance moving coming out of the Panjshir Valley. I don't think it can go very far. I hate to be cynical, without foreign support. That's just the nature of the game. But it is something where the Taliban are going to have a PR headache in that there's this resistance group that's still there within it. Keep an eye on what the Taliban try to do about that, and keep an eye on how other powers maneuver with that, because I suspect the one power that might support that group is India. Because every broadcast I've done with Indian television this week, they have brought up that movement in the Panjshir Valley. What do you think of that? And broadcasters don't operate independent of officials and other people who tend to put out the message. And so that I think is the week ahead. But of course, beyond that, guys, the week ahead is just keep everyone in your thoughts who are the good folks who may be in hiding, who may have to be tucking themselves away, and keep the channels of communication over with whoever you can as we go into the next phase.
And I don't have a ton of resources or places where you can donate to and stuff. I haven't had a lot of time to, because I'm very interested in this as well, to vet anybody, but I'm putting this link up here. Do a little vetting yourself. But I think womenforwomen.org, I think they're doing some good stuff in Iraq, but I'm not going to endorse them because I don't know some of their philosophical approaches and ideas and stuff, but I think they're doing pretty well.
Well, Rev, if people want to hit me up on Twitter, or Monique, I think you'll be open to it as well. If they want to hit us up on Twitter, we'll start to, I've seen a couple things even today. For example, a movement for Afghan women journalists, which is now recalibrating what they're doing. Joy's come in as well and offered sources. Let's just stay in touch with each other. This is the power of social media to try to find out who's doing what, and we'll take it from there. And so, but that we've just gone over the hour, Rev, and I realize that folks got their lives. And you got a kid coming home, and
it's what now? About 10 p.m. there in Birmingham. Wait, where are you actually?
It's 10 p.m. I'm here.
You're in Birmingham.
I'm in Birmingham, England, right in the middle, in the backwaters, even though it's the second largest city. But my wife has gone out tonight with friends, which is why I could set the studio up in the front room.
So, nice.
Exactly.
Is there a distinctly Birmingham regional accent or anything there?
Oh, good Lord, Rev. There is, and it is so distinctive. Don't you ever try to get me to do it, because I can't. But I will put it this way, Rev. I'm sure you know that where I come from in the Alabama with the accent of us rednecks. Yeah, we get to have the laughingstock accent in Alabama. Guess who has the laughingstock accent in the UK?
Birmingham, huh?
It's Brummies. Yeah, it's Brummies. And I say that Perry Pilot. I'm sorry, hon, but that's just, we know that's the way that the folks tend to look at us. But
I know that it's not exactly Bath with all those posh people, but you know.
No, we definitely ain't posh in Birmingham, but we're good folks. I mean, as I
I
said,
love it.
I came here in '89. I thought I was here it was the first time I'd ever seen Birmingham. The day I got my job, I said I'd be out of here in 2 years. You know what? Over 30 years later, and it's been good to me.
Professor Emeritus, I think that's a pretty big deal, and shows that you accomplished a lot. And I really look forward, Scott. And by the way, you look great. You must have gotten your degree when you were 10, and the just look forward to having you back. And definitely, Monique, I think you're still out there, and Olga and I are talking. Monique, I would love to have you on too, and let's talk, and then get the group together and get some different people together. Anytime anybody wants to talk politics, I'm always game. And I really appreciate you, sir, because having somebody with such in-depth knowledge on this, I swear we could probably talk for 6 hours, on this. So I'm looking forward to doing something again.
Hey, Rav, it's been an absolute pleasure. You and all you folks out there, keep fighting the good fight. All right. Stay safe. We'll prevail.
Hey, and you know what? I did want to mention that too. I appreciate that you putting that positivity in there and us keeping this together. And yeah, solidarity, folks. We've got a lot of issues that we need to work on, but really appreciate that we could shed some light on this one, and maybe somebody, will be able to get involved from this show to help this thing move along better. Thanks again, Scott. Great to see you. Great to meet you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Everybody on the replay and right now, scoochcase.com. Buy a case. We are coming maybe with a different sponsor soon. We'll see. We're talking. And you guys have a great one. We'll be back. Is today Thursday? We should have a show on Friday. I know I haven't been very reliable, but September is getting lined up and we're launching back. So thanks again, Scott.
Thank you, sir. You're the best.
Appreciate it, man. Stay right there, Scott, because we will not get disconnected here. We'll chat for a second. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Much love to all of you. Much love to all of you that support me. Remember, you could give me $5 a month. Hit the sponsor link and sponsor some other broadcasters as well. Peace be with you, and namaste.